When a house fire erupts in a quiet Florida neighborhood, first responders find a mother and her young daughter deceased inside the home. Investigators search for the killer who set the fire in an attempt to destroy evidence of a double homicide in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
As always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
A quick heads up, this episode involves the death of a child victim. It also contains mention of sexual assault. Please listen with care. Heather and Kira Radcliffe were last seen alive on December 8, 2006. They were mother and daughter and were 28 and 6 years old, respectively. Heather and Kira lived in Gainesville, Florida, a city that was home to about 120,000 people at the time. There, along with their dog and cat, they shared a 2-bedroom home on Northwest 32nd Place. Their house was situated close to several others in Gainesville's Ridgeview neighborhood on a cul-de-sac shaded by tall trees draped with Spanish moss. It was a cute, quiet, and affordable neighborhood, which was important to Heather as a single mom. Now, Heather had been raising Kira on her own for years. Kira's dad lived in another state and wasn't actively involved in her life, so Heather worked hard to provide a stable, comfortable home for her. She was a certified arborist and worked as the supervisor of a tree trimming crew for a Gainesville business called Gator Tree Service. She'd always had a passion for the outdoors, so the job was a good fit. There weren't many other women in her field, but she didn't mind. She'd take working outside over an office job any day.
Actually a really good career field, and I know there's a lot of those services that happen in Florida. It's a really unique skill set to have.
And it's a very necessary service that they provide, for sure. And Heather had, in fact, started out working in the company's office, making phone calls and running errands, stuff like that. Over the years, though, she'd worked hard, not just at her assigned duties, but at expanding her professional skill set. She'd become a certified arborist and eventually a crew supervisor. Her ascent was a big accomplishment, and she aspired to achieve even more. By the time December of 2006 rolled around, she was also enrolled in college courses studying toward a degree in urban forestry. 6-year-old Kira had inherited her mom's love of the outdoors. When Heather wasn't working, the two of them spent a lot of time together at local beaches and lakes. They were also both avid Florida Gators fans and would cheer them on together whenever they had the chance to watch a game. 6-year-old Kira attended a local elementary school where she was a friendly and especially artistic first-grade student. She loved to sing and to draw, and dolphins, rainbows, and butterflies were all staples in her artwork. A close friend of Heather and Kira's, a woman named Catherine, who Kira considered a grandmother, told the Gainesville Sun that Kira's love of butterflies was fitting. Quote, "She was a butterfly. She made friends with everyone." End quote. Overall, things were going pretty well for Heather and Kira that winter. They'd gone through an emotionally trying time the year before when Heather's mom had passed away, but they were persevering despite the loss, and the future looked bright. On December 9th, Heather, Kira, and their dog all went together to a local tree farm where they carefully selected a Christmas tree for their living room. After making their choice, they drove home with the tree bundled in the bed of Heather's silver Honda Ridgeline pickup truck. The tree was too large for Heather to carry inside on her own, so they left it in the bed of the truck and planned to move it inside later when they could get a friend or a family member to help. Then the three of them, Heather, Kira, and their dog, all stepped into their home for the last time. The following morning at about 6:30 a.m., their neighbors noticed that their house was on fire, and I mean really on fire, with flames erupting from the roof. A neighbor called 911 and the local fire department responded. About a mile, or 1.6 kilometers away from Heather and Kira's house, Heather's sister, Maria, was woken up by the sound of sirens as fire vehicles rushed towards Northwest 32nd Place. Of course, at the time, Maria had no way of knowing that they were responding to a fire at her sister's home, and yet she knew something was wrong just the same. She later told True Crime News, quote, "I knew right there and then that something was wrong, and I didn't know what it was, but there was a gut feeling." End quote. Unfortunately, Maria's intuition was accurate. When Gainesville firefighters arrived at Heather and Kira's home, they found the house actively burning with a large hole already burnt above the house's bedroom area. It was bad enough that they knew that if anyone was inside, they were in serious danger, possibly even dead already. Still, there was a chance they might be alive, so they staged a rescue mission and entered the burning house. Over the sound of the flames, they could hear a persistent ringing noise. They weren't sure what it was. It didn't sound like a smoke alarm, but they hoped it was a positive sign. Firefighters followed the sound to the living room. There, the scene before them was crushing. Kira was there, but she was already deceased. Her body lay on the floor, and her mom's cell phone, the source of the noise, lay just beside her. Investigators would later determine that Kira had been trying to call for help, but had died before she'd been able to finish dialing the number of a family friend. And Kira wasn't the only victim. Firefighters found Heather's body in her bedroom and the dog's body in the home office. The only household member unaccounted for was the cat, who had managed to escape and would later be found and taken in by neighbors. As devastating as Heather and Kira's deaths were, at first, it seemed as if it had all been a tragic accident. Heather's family figured the fire had probably been electrical, and Heather's brother, Bob, said that there had been a ceiling fan in the residence that hadn't worked quite right, and that maybe that had had some sort of electrical problem. That, he told investigators and later True Crime News, may have been the source of the fire.
Okay.
To the trained eye, however, the fire was suspicious. Fire investigator Kelly DeRasmo, who responded to the scene, determined, with the help of a specially trained canine, that the fire had had 2 separate ignition points.
Okay. Obviously a telling sign.
Yeah, as I'm sure you know, as a former firefighter, more than one ignition point is often an indicator of arson, since it's really unlikely that 2 separate fires would spontaneously erupt at the same time in 2 different places in the same residence.
Yeah, that's highly unlikely.
Right, so as soon as investigator DeRasmo noticed that there were 2 ignition points, she knew the fire had been deliberately set.
There's very, very few circumstances where I would see that being even possible, and the location of those 2 spots would be very telling.
Sure. The realization made the sight of the victims' bodies, especially little Kira's with a phone at hand, that much more heartbreaking. And the heartbreak was compounded for everyone involved, but especially for Heather and Kira's family, when Heather and Kira's autopsy results revealed even more unexpected details. Neither Heather nor Kira had died as a direct result of the fire. Rather, they'd been violently attacked and the fire had been set afterward. The medical examiner determined that Heather had been shot 3 times, once in the chest and twice in the head. By the time the fire had started, she'd already been deceased.
That's a very aggressive way to shoot somebody. Shooting twice in the head is very brutal and shows high levels of aggression.
It does. It's very aggressive, and whoever did this wanted to make absolutely sure that she was deceased and had no chance of survival. As for 6-year-old Kira, she'd met a different fate. She'd been strangled. Strangulation injuries combined with smoke inhalation had been what had killed her as she'd tried her best to call for help.
To strangle a 6-year-old, that is an incredibly vile and brutal act. Your average criminal is not going to do that. Everything about this murder seems to scream very personal overkill and high levels of emotional hatred.
Yes, it was a very, very cold move to strangle a child like that. And it's obvious, I think, that Heather was the intended victim and that poor Kira was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Realizing that Heather and Kira had been murdered and that the fire had been set to destroy evidence, detectives from the Gainesville Police Department launched an investigation. Unfortunately, the arsonist had succeeded in destroying evidence. Fingerprint and DNA evidence that might normally have been found at such a scene had gone up in smoke. Investigators gathered evidence for forensic testing anyway, but the results, if any, would not prove sufficient to solve the case. Meanwhile, investigators pieced together what they believe happened on the night of Heather and Kira's deaths. According to multiple sources, like reporting for the Gainesville Sun, here's what they say likely occurred. At some point, hours before the killer set fire to the home, they walked through its front door. The fact that the family dog was shut inside of the home office, which was where Heather often put the dog when guests visited, suggests that the killer may have been someone she knew.
That goes along with exactly my thoughts on why there was so much overkill with this attack.
Right. This definitely seems like a personal crime. Now, whether or not the killer's visit was expected or a surprise is unknown. In any case, the killer probably sexually assaulted Heather at some point. Investigators believe this because when they found Heather's body, it was only partially clothed. At some point, possibly after the probable sexual assault, the killer shot Heather 3 times, like we discussed, twice in the head and once in the chest. These injuries killed her. Meanwhile, Kira, presumably awakened by the sound of conflict or perhaps of gunfire, got out of bed and courageously attempted to rush to her mom's rescue, despite only being 6 years old. She retrieved her mom's phone from the living room and tried to call a family friend who worked for the local police department. Unfortunately, she made a mistake while dialing their number and the call didn't go through. Realizing that Kira was out of bed, the killer confronted her as she was starting to head toward her mom's bedroom, trying once again to dial for help. Then, in an effort to eliminate Kira as a witness, the killer strangled her and left her for dead. Which, again, points to him being someone, I think, that Heather and Kira probably both knew and would recognize.
Yeah, I think so.
The killer then went to either purchase or retrieve gasoline from somewhere, returned to the house, dumped gasoline on the mattresses in both Heather and Kira's bedrooms, and set them ablaze. When the fire was set, Kira was badly injured, but still alive. As she inhaled smoke from the fire, unable to flee and perhaps still unconscious, the lack of oxygen killed her. When neighbors noticed the fire, they called 911, summoning fire and police to the scene. Investigators spoke to those neighbors and others, hoping to gain helpful information. They were at a loss to explain who might have wanted to harm Heather and Kira. As far as they knew, Heather had no known enemies. In fact, most people, including family members, friends, and Heather's boss, had plenty of good things to say about her. Heather's boss, the owner of Gator Tree Service, spoke to a journalist and commended Heather both for the excellent care she demonstrated for trees while on the job and for her willingness to work in a heavily male-dominated field. Heather's friends also spoke to journalists, describing her as an especially caring friend who not only found time for her friends despite being busy with parenting, work, and school, but as someone who went above and beyond in thoughtfulness, often giving her friends gifts she knew they'd enjoy, or flowers. It was clear to investigators. Heather was loved by her friends and family. But of course, no one gets along with everyone. On that note, naturally, they looked into Kira's father, Heather's ex. However, he lived all the way in North Carolina and had an alibi for the night of the double-homicide. Investigators looked into other exes of Heather's too, but to the best of my knowledge, nothing substantial came from those inquiries. Early on in the investigation, detectives reached out to Florida's state law enforcement agency, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, to request a criminal profile from a behavioral analyst. Here's what the profile they received had to say, according to reporting by Lise Fisher for the Gainesville Sun. Quote, "The profile indicated a lone killer who likely has a violent criminal history or has served a prison sentence. It did not describe the suspect's race, but indicated a person who was likely male and old enough to have been in prison with an age range from 20 to 50, end quote."
That's really not very helpful.
Often when you hear these profiles, you're like, that's so specific. Man, how did they piece that all together? And then I hear this and I'm like, oh, it was a man who was violent. Well, obviously.
No, it's very vague.
Now, of course, that's a pretty sparse description. It could apply to any of thousands of Floridians. But, there may have been more to the profile that the journalist in the newspaper article just didn't mention for whatever reason, or perhaps that wasn't shared with them.
Yeah.
It may have been more robust and we just don't know, but I found the way it was described in the article kind of unusual. Now, notably, the profile, if what was published by the Gainesville Sun included the entirety of its predictions, that is, does not mention anything about whether or not the killer was someone Heather knew. I think we can say, though, it probably was.
I'm going to say it likely was, just given the amount of violence perpetrated to them and the fact that she moved the dog into the office, which is what she did when somebody came to visit.
Right. She would not have been doing that if a stranger was bursting into her home or something.
No, that doesn't make sense. So I would say that we're probably pretty on the dot with that.
Right. So, as you can see, solving Heather and Kira's case would be far from open and shut, but investigators persevered. Gainesville experiences its fair share of violent crime. The city's violent crime rates are higher than both the national average and the Florida average. Still, a mother and young daughter being brutally murdered back-to-back in their own home was a very unusual and disturbing crime. Of the 7 homicides that occurred in Gainesville in the year 2006, Heather and Kira's double homicide was almost certainly the most shocking. As unthinkable as the crime was, though, It had happened, and someone, most likely someone local to the community, and likely even someone Heather had known and trusted to some degree, had committed it. In an effort to figure out who that someone was, investigators spoke to many of Heather's family members, friends, neighbors, and acquaintances. And one friend told them about something that had happened a few months before Heather's death, something that proved that someone had harbored ill will toward Heather. More on that next. And now, back to Heather and Kira's story. When investigators first set out to determine who had murdered Heather Radcliffe and her 6-year-old daughter, Kira, they didn't have much to go on. Much of the forensic evidence had been destroyed by the fire the killer had set to their home afterward, and 28-year-old Heather had had no known enemies. At least, no enemies that investigators had known about at first. That changed when they spoke to a friend of Heather's. That friend also spoke to the Gainesville Sun, but didn't want to be identified by name out of fear of the killer who was, and still may be, to the best of public knowledge, at large. So, we don't know who that friend was, but we do know what they had to say. A few months before Heather's death, someone had slashed her tires.
Going back to that personal vendetta against Heather.
Yeah, not only that, but Heather had believed she'd known exactly who had done it.
Had she?
Now, I don't know who the person who Heather suspected of slashing her tires was. I assume, though, that based off of what her friend has said, that investigators are well aware of their identity.
Okay.
And Scott, I do certainly think that the act of property destruction is a red flag.
Yeah, it's targeting a specific individual for any known number of reasons, but it definitely says, hey, you're a target, and hey, I'm willing to violate the law in order to target you.
Yes, and plus, by destroying Heather's tires, that person was taking a significant chunk of money directly out of a hardworking single mom's pocket. That's a pretty cruel thing to do, and obviously demonstrates animosity and, like you said, a willingness to break the law. As for whether or not investigators believe that the tire slasher and the killer were one and the same, I don't know. What I do know, though, is that, as we've so often said on this show, when women are murdered, they're usually murdered by men in their lives. Often, those men are current or former romantic partners, but not always. And when it comes to the men in Heather's life, there's a significant group of them we haven't really discussed yet, her coworkers.
When I've been going through my head of people that I would suspect, she's a successful woman in a male-dominated field, and she's a supervisor of a crew. Obviously, not everybody in the male-dominated field is going to be okay with that.
Yeah, we've covered another case somewhat similar to this before, Julie Weflin's case. She was a female in a very male-dominated field. There were no other women working there, and that was one thing that investigators had to consider in her case.
Yeah, it's a very natural place for the mind to go, but it wouldn't surprise me if somebody felt jilted by the fact that she was the supervisor instead of them and was jealous and angry about it.
Right. What if one of Heather's coworkers resented her for simply being a woman who told them what to do?
Yeah, and I'm not sure what kind of crews these were, but going back to that criminal profile, some of them may have convicts or people that have spent time in prison on them before in the past too. Manual labor tends to attract that.
That's true. Some fields of work can be tough to get into if you have a criminal history, especially a felony conviction. And other jobs don't care about that as much. And often, the more difficult and laborious a job is, the less likely they are to care because those jobs are hard to fill.
They are.
So another possibility, I think, is that she could have turned down a sexual advance from a coworker or colleague. That perhaps could have spurred this animosity.
That would have also gone hand in hand with the sexual assault.
Right, because rape is a power crime, and if this person was trying to get back at her for the power that she wielded over them as a supervisor, that could have been a very appealing act to them.
100%.
Now, neither scenario, the jealousy and anger over her position at work or jealousy and anger over being turned down sexually, neither of these is difficult to imagine, especially since Heather was an attractive woman who I'm sure caught the attention of many men. During the course of her work as an arborist, Heather likely interacted with hundreds of men, from her own co-workers at Gator Tree Service to property managers to employees of landscaping and other companies that they dealt with during the course of their work.
Not to mention just homeowners in general also.
Sure. We're talking about a very wide pool of potential persons of interest. It's not even limited to other employees of Gator Tree Service. It could be another similar company. Now, additionally, there's another aspect to Heather's life that I feel I'd be remiss not to mention, and that's that she'd had a couple of encounters with law enforcement. She'd been arrested once for DUI and another time for marijuana possession. The latter offense, while minor and something that wouldn't even be a crime in many other states, catches my attention in particular. And let me be clear, I'm not trying to make a mountain out of the molehill that is a personal use quantity of marijuana. The fact that Heather used marijuana is, in and of itself, likely of no importance to the investigation. Or perhaps I should say, it would likely be of no importance if she'd lived somewhere where she could have obtained it through a safe, legal retail venue. But when something is made illegal, it creates an illegal market, and there's always some element of danger and risk associated with engaging with an illegal market, even if it's only as an end user.
You're dealing with people who, by their very nature, are criminals. They are selling a product illegally. It does show that she was interacting with people that have questionable motives and morals.
Sure, when there is money to be made in an illegal way in an illegal market, violence is always associated with that.
100%.
It goes hand in hand. So if a murder victim was known to use illegal substances of any kind, it's likely worth asking whether their death might possibly have occurred at the hands of someone involved in some way in the illegal drug trade.
That makes perfect sense.
Again, I don't bring up Heather's past charges as an indictment of her character, only as a possibly relevant detail of her life.
Yeah, and it does kind of tie into the coworkers having criminal convictions also. If she herself had one, her company likely would have hired other people that had those convictions too.
Yeah, that's true. Now, I do want to point out that the crimes for which she had been charged were misdemeanor offenses, not a big felony or anything like that. But you're right, it didn't hold her back from succeeding at work. She did a great job at work, and that's what they cared about.
Yeah.
Now, with so many potential persons of interest, coworkers, exes, and possibly people involved in the illegal marijuana trade, investigators certainly have their work cut out for them with this case. And of course, a question any investigator might ask themselves in an effort to identify a suspect is, have any similar crimes occurred in or near the area?
As a crime analyst, I'm sure you've been questioning that.
That's one of the first questions I would ask myself if this were a case that I was dealing with at work instead of in a podcast. And okay, it's also a question I immediately ask when dealing with it in a podcast. So yes.
Yes.
And in this case, the answer to that question is yes. Definitely yes.
Okay.
On March 17th, 2005, about a year and 9 months before Heather and Kira's deaths, another local woman died in an eerily similar way. Her name was Wende Ellinger, and she was a 34-year-old mom of 3. She lived on the outskirts of Gainesville, less than a half-hour's drive from where Heather and Kira lived. Like Heather, she was pretty, blonde, and a single mom. She'd been married previously, but she and her former husband had divorced the year prior to her death. The divorce had been a tough one to navigate, but dealing with its effects wasn't the only difficulty in Wendy's life at the time of her death. According to reporting for the Gainesville Sun, she'd also recently lost the job she'd held at a local insurance company. On top of that, custody of Wendy's 3 children had been given to one of their grandparents. Since the divorce, she and her ex-husband had been embroiled in a contentious custody battle, and ultimately the courts had decided that, at least for a while anyway, neither parent would be given custody of the children. This was a tough time in her life, and she was living alone in her double-wide mobile home in her neighborhood on the outskirts of Gainesville. Now, her children did visit frequently, and she spent as much time with them as possible, but not having them living with her still stung.
I'm sure it would.
Despite all of these significant difficulties, at the time of her death, Wende was doing her best to move forward and establish a stable life as an independent single person. Those efforts all came to a crashing halt, though, on the night of March 17th. At just after midnight, a neighbor noticed that Wendy's home was smoking and called 911. One neighbor even rushed over to Wendy's home with a fire extinguisher in an effort to help, but the fire was too advanced to be suppressed with just a fire extinguisher. When investigators arrived, they saw a vehicle tearing away from the scene. It would turn out, though, that the driver was just someone who'd noticed the fire and was trying to get help. Whoever had actually set the fire was long gone, and whoever had set the fire had also murdered Wende. Investigators realized that after Wende was found inside of her burning home, deceased, but not from the fire. She had clearly sustained deadly injuries prior to the fire being set. What kind of deadly injuries, I don't know. Investigators haven't revealed the cause of her death to the public. The manner of her death, however, was initially ruled suspicious by the medical examiner. However, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement now calls her death a definite homicide. Investigators may not be sure of what the motive behind Wendy's killing was, but they're pretty sure it was not robbery. Assorted electronics and easily portable valuables, TVs, for example, had been found inside of her home after the fire, apparently untouched. Like Heather and Kira's case, Wendy's case remains unsolved. As for whether the two cases may be related or are only coincidentally alike, I don't know. Considering the many similarities, though, I thought that Wendy's case warranted mentioning. And when it comes to potential suspects in Wendy's case, investigators have considered a variety of people, from Wendy's ex-husband to patrons of a restaurant Wendy had had dinner at on the evening before her death. That restaurant was called Gainesville Ale House, and an article by journalist Deborah Ball published just a couple weeks after Wendy's death stated that detectives were seeking witnesses who had any, quote, information about who was seen talking with or leaving the restaurant with Ellinger to come forward, end quote.
I mean, I could definitely see why they'd be interested in anybody that left or talked to her there. It would be one of the last people to have any real interactions with her.
Sure. Investigators say that Wendy returned home from the restaurant alone. However, that doesn't necessarily rule out someone from the bar as a potential suspect. Someone could have followed her or tracked her down later.
Especially if she had turned somebody down at the bar and they found this unbearable.
Definitely.
If they're willing to murder somebody, being turned down at a bar could be all that was required to set them off.
Right. Alternatively, Wendy's killer may have been someone she knew well. She'd divorced her ex-husband the year prior to her death, and as we've said many times before on this show, women who leave abusive relationships are in more danger of being killed by their abusive partners in the year following a breakup than they are while they're still actually in the relationship.
And if she's going to bars, a potential abusive former partner could see that as a sign of moving on or reclaiming some of that power. I could see that being a triggering point too.
I could as well. And Wendy's relationship with her ex-husband had allegedly been abusive. According to reporting for the Gainesville Sun, court records showed that Wendy had filed several complaints accusing him of, quote, violating an injunction for protection against domestic violence, end quote. Or as we would call it a little more concisely here, violating a protective order.
Yeah, that's definitely a massive red flag.
Also, according to that Gainesville Sun article, Wendy's dad alleged that there had been issues when it came to child support payments in the past. As for whether or not Wendy's ex-husband had an alibi for the night of her death, it's unclear. Reporting on her case has been relatively sparse. Investigators are still seeking information on her death from the public. Now, during the course of my research for this case, I also came across another Gainesville case where a mother and daughter pair were murdered in their home and their home set on fire afterward.
For it to happen more than once is concerning, but to happen more than twice?
Yeah, it certainly caught my attention, and whether or not it means something or it's just coincidence, I can't say. Either way, this case happened about a decade before Heather and Kira's in 1994. Like Heather and Kira, the victims had been mother and daughter. However, they had not been young. Treva Gernannt had been 88 years old at the time, and her daughter, Emily Wallace, had been either in her 60s or 70s. Her reported age varies by news source.
Okay, so that falls way out of the other victims' similarities.
Yes, this is a very strange crime. So, Treva and Emily had lived together in their Gainesville home. On December 1st, 1994, at about 1:45 in the morning, others in the neighborhood had noticed smoke coming from their home. Fortunately, there was someone nearby with a cell phone, which they used to call 911. When first responders arrived, the house was ablaze. Eventually, they found Treva and Emily deceased in their respective bedrooms. At first, investigators believed that the fire had been accidental. They were so confident, in fact, that they told the media that, and the Miami Herald published an article explaining that their house's furnace had been the source of the tragic but accidental fire. It was actually Treva and Emily's autopsies that ended up painting a very different picture. According to the pathologist who performed them, both women had died prior to the fire. Treva had been repeatedly and fatally stabbed in the neck, and Emily, well, her body was too badly burnt for her exact cause of death to be determined. The lack of smoke in her lungs, however, made it clear that she had died before the fire had begun.
Okay, so that's another very violent attack, very personal.
Right. Now, knowing that Treva and Emily were murdered, the fire that erupted afterward was presumably an act of arson by the killer, although, to be fair, none of the articles I read on this case say that outright. It's probably a safe assumption, though.
It is. I don't believe in coincidences. It would be way too lucky for this violent murderer to have the furnace just go up in flames and start this whole house on fire and cover up all that evidence.
Yes, extremely unlikely. Now, in any case, according to an article published in the Indian River Press Journal, Treva and Emily's home had been burglarized often.
Okay.
So it's possible that whoever killed Treva and Emily had done so during the course of a robbery or during the course of what they'd intended to be a simple burglary. However, that's only one possibility and is far from a sure thing. Investigators did attempt to determine whether anything of value had been taken from the home, but the fire damage made that difficult to determine. The theory is reasonably compelling, though, not just because of the past burglaries, but because it's just so difficult to imagine who might have wanted to brutally murder two older single women.
Yeah, it's definitely an outlier for sure. But whenever somebody's committing one of these crimes, it's just a small step to seeing their livelihood flash before their eyes and thinking that they have to murder somebody so that they can stay free.
That's true. I definitely think that Treva and Emily being killed during the course of a robbery or burglary gone wrong is a plausible theory. However, the fact that both victims were killed in their separate respective bedrooms gives me pause. Assuming that the victims were killed where they were found, in their bedrooms, this suggests that their killer went through the house, killing them separately as they found them, perhaps even as they slept, which seems odd if the killer had gone there simply intending to burglarize the home. I mean, if they entered the home with the intent to steal and then realized that people were home, why not just leave? It doesn't sound as if the victims confronted the intruder, and even if they had, well, they were elderly women. An intruder probably could have easily escaped the home and fled into the night without any need for violence.
My only concern is that if one of them woke up and was able to recognize or identify the killer.
That's a possibility as well. It seems strange, though, right?
It does seem strange. I definitely think that this is somebody that knew them, like the others.
I suspect the same because, like I mentioned, Treva died of repeated stab wounds to the neck, which is a pretty vicious method of homicide. Potentially, this could indicate a personal motive behind the killing.
Yeah.
She was almost 90. Even if someone wanted to kill her, repeatedly stabbing her in the neck was not really necessary.
The first question that comes to my mind, obviously, when you're talking about the murder of somebody that's elderly and in almost 90, as you said, is, was there somebody that stood to gain anything from the murder of these two women?
That's a question I also asked myself when I was researching this case, but ultimately, I don't know. I don't know what other relatives or survivors they had. I don't know what kind of assets they had. I don't know what their plans were for those assets after death. But it's a compelling question, especially since both mother and daughter were killed. You know, I assume it would have been likely, given their living situation, that if only the mother had died, perhaps her daughter would have inherited whatever assets she had, the house if they owned it. But if they were both gone, who knows?
It's an interesting theory, and I think it's just a natural question anybody would have, given the circumstances.
I think so. Now, according to Gainesville police, the last people to see Treva and Emily alive had been members of their church. Emily had attended church on the evening of her death, while Treva had stayed home because she hadn't been feeling well. Some members of the church had come to visit her at home, and they ended up being the last people to see her alive. Whether that had anything to do with the double homicide that occurred later that night is unknown.
Okay.
Also unknown is whether any of the three cases we just discussed, Heather and Kira's, Wendy's, and Treva and Emily's, are related in any way. Although they share many similarities, setting fire to a crime scene in order to destroy evidence is far from unheard of. The similarities among these cases may be just coincidental, but they certainly stand out, especially in a relatively small city. Tragically, one of the similarities that these cases share is the fact that they're all unsolved. So if you know anything about the deaths of Heather and Kira Radcliffe, or about the death of Wende Ellinger, or the deaths of Treva Gernannt and Emily Wallace, please call the Gainesville Police Department at 352-393-7500. And if you found this episode to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the unsolved mother-daughter homicide/disappearance of Nikki and Ariana Fitz. We aired an episode in which we revisited their case on January 20th, 2025. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta and Twitter at LSA Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like Heather and Kira's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Last Seen Alive is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.